A fire was burning in Rachel's chamber, and Bloody Johnny, when he caught the glowing essence of this enchanting room, felt a sudden clutch in the pit of his stomach, while an outrageous and wild thought seized upon his mind. Mr. Gear noticed on one side of this vaulted chamber a subsidiary archway containing a small, heavily bolted door. Lady Rachel intercepted his glance. "Let's take him over the Bridge of Sighs," she whispered excitedly to her father. The Marquis swung round on his heel and glowered for a moment with a cold glint of something worse than animosity at Mr. Geard. Lord P possessed a peculiarity inherited from his ancestors of being subject at times to a savage antisocial spasm, a spasm of dangerous repugnance, dividing him and his, as if by a wedge of boreal ice from the particular specimens of humanity he encountered. This characteristic was one which almost all the intimates of Lord P, unless they had blood in their veins recognized by himself as equal with his own, sooner or later came upon collision with. It is a sentimental mistake to assume that the real aristocracy is free from snobbishness. Why wouldn't you think that? I don't get that. It is free from the perturbation of spirit in the presence of social ritual, which is an accompaniment of snobbishness in ordinary people. But if any psychologist plays with the illusion that such great gentlemen are simple, natural, and naive in their absence of pride, he's making a profound mistake. Yeah, I don't think any of them would do that, but... Alright, enough commentary from me. The historic House of Zoyland, descended from Charlemagne on one hand and from Rollo the Varangian on the other, had certain peculiarities that separated them altogether from the humbler gentlefolk of England. They had qualities that were unique to themselves and will die with them. One of these was this ice-cold, blindly pitiless frenzy of scorn for normal flesh and blood, when they grew aware of it in a certain condition of their nerves. This was the first and last occasion, however, in the life of the Marquis of P, when this projectile of frozen scorn for his interlocutor produced absolutely no effect on the person at whom it was directed. Mr. Geard was in touch with a presence that had defeated the principalities and powers of this proud planet centuries before the Norsemen came to Byzantium, or Roland's horn was heard at Fontarabia. Thus it was, with a slight weary indulgence, too patient and unperturbed to be even ironical, that Bloody Johnny returned, stare for stare, the withering Eliade of his noble host. I'm not going to look that up. I learned my lesson last time not to do that. Lady Rachel, however, quite oblivious of this psychic episode, had begun to unbolt with girlish impetuosity the great iron bars that secured this archway door. She pulled it open, inwards into the room, when she had drawn its final bolt. And Mr. Geard, whose eyes, leaving those of the devil-ridden nobleman, had wandered over this warm, virginal, medieval room, and now met hers as she held fast to the thing's iron-wrought handle and kept the door ajar, smiled at her in unembarrassed response. From the girl's face his eyes now wandered again round the various objects of this remote little turret chamber. There was a queer silence among the three of them when he did this. The reddened smoke from the fireplace, and the long yellow flame from the candle which the Marquis held, moving fitfully to and fro, as the wind rushed in from the stone archway she had uncovered, went eddying curiously round the walls. Bloody Johnny noticed that the girl's bed, situated in an archway opposite of the other one where she was now standing, was covered with a dark green coverlet, upon the center of which the Zoyland arms, a falcon clutching a bare sword, was worked in dusky crimson. A small shelf of books, They all seemed to be unbound French books, whose paperbacks looked singularly out of keeping with the rest of the interior. Hung at the bed's head, while over the wall space of the corresponding archway opposite the hearth was suspended a strip of faded tapestry, the figures upon which it was impossible to decipher in the flickering light, as the wind, stealing behind it, made it swell and bulge like a heavy sail, and then again subside into the level darkness of its obscurity. But the silence of that room became itself a tapestry of obscure figures that lifted and sank and lifted, each one of those three minds offering its own secret pattern of the occult weaving of that pregnant moment. The girl alone, woman-like, was aware of the flowingness of time. For the other time was static. For Gerd it was a static eternal, with that wind-shaken piece of old tapestry sinking down, with all three of them into other dimensions. For Lord P it was a static superficial, with attention stretched taut, like the leash of a straining dog. But to the girl, as she held ajar that heavy oaken door, keeping the wild wind out and yet not keeping it quite out, there came just then an exultant feeling of lovely, continuous flowingness. How strong and mysterious men are, she thought to herself. But oh, I'm glad I'm not a man. Ned isn't a man either. And what a good thing he isn't. Ned's only a boy. You couldn't manage these strong mysteries men like I can. It was the Marquis who made the gesture that broke the spell. But even he did not speak in order to do it. He made a sign to his daughter to go ahead, and he made a sign to Gerd to follow her. He himself followed with his hand over the candle flame, and indeed it was necessary for him to give the door a vicious kick with his foot to close it before he could cross that covered stoneway after them, and enter King Mark's death chamber. This they entered by a similar door to the one he had closed, and he managed to get the candle safe into the great empty place without letting the wind annihilate its tender flame. Once inside King Mark's room and the little door shut behind him, Lord P laid the candle down on a vast piece of furniture that looked like a long refectory table in a monastery in South Russia, and returning to the door through which they had come, closed it with unnecessary violence. Very specific, huh? Refectory table at a monastery in South Russia. The young girl ran forward now to the hearth fire, which was burning very badly. Huge clouds of smoke hung issuing from it. Clouds had rolled across the room and mounted up among the high rafters. Mr. Gerd watched her intently for a second as she went down to select a few more inflammable billets of wood to throw in on the top of the ones that were smoldering so slowly and unsatisfactorily there. With the smoke rising up its wisps and eddies round her, her figure took on an almost unearthly waveringness, as if she had been a sylph of the elements, a being that was taking refuge from a wind demon outside in the arms of the fire demon inside. He then glanced at the couch that Will Zoylan had carried up for him. It was just a Boy Scout camp bed, but they had covered it with a vast ancient coverlet, like the one that covered Lady Rachel's bed, only this was of a dark purplish color. And while it had upon it, in faded embroidery, the falcon clutching the sword, an ugly rent in it had rendered the bird headless. Mr. Gerd moved slowly to the fireplace, but he began to cough as the smoke got into his throat. "There!" cried the girl with a deep breath, prodding the smoldering logs with a thick iron rod, hooked at the end, which looked as if it had served for this purpose in days when iron had only just begun to be used. She let this Homeric utensil fall with a clatter on the stone coping of the earth. "If the smoke makes you cough when you're in bed," she said, while a darting red flame lit up her face, "you can lug your couch under the window and leave the window open. That's what I do with my fire smokes. These old chimneys always smoke when they're first lit." She paused, and a spasm of intense concern puckered her brow. "You don't suppose there was any swallow's nest in the chimney, do you?" she asked. Her mouth remained open after the words left, and her eyes grew round. The Marquis, who had been fumbling at the latches of one of the windows, got it open now, and as he got in, open, the wind came in with such a wild rush that he jumped back in dismay. Lady Rachel observed this occurrence with childish interest, and in her fit of momentary nervousness, being wrought up by her anxiety over the possibility of nests in the chimney, she forgot her good breeding and laughed out loud. Her laughter must have been the final issue of a long series of suppressed days, for it burst out through the smoke with a quivering ring of something hysterical. Through the brain of Mr. Gurd there rushed, like a frantic swallow beating its wings to escape, the word Nemu, and with the words the original of the name Vivian, a spasm of mingled emotions, sweet and troubling. But the Marquis was really annoyed now. That there should have arisen all this unusual fuss over his old friend Johnny Gurd of Montacute was in itself not a little inappropriate. But, after all, he himself had been responsible for it. But the bastard's words, though rejected at the time, had already begun to work on the subtle old statesman's mind, and he felt as if there was something in the air of King Mark's chamber that night which was unsuitable, incongruous, and out of control. That hysterical note of his daughter's laugh, when the inrush of wind made him leap backwards, taunted his mind, as they say in Somerset. He bit his underlip as he rushed to the casement, to begin with both his hands and click the two iron latches. Women and... he muttered under his breath impatiently. He meant to say women and conjurers, but instead of conjurers, the lips within the lips, which people use when they are obsessed in the curious way, uttered the words Caer City, words which an eccentric Oxford scholar, when drunk enough to talk freely to him, had once repeated in his ears with tipsy reiteration. The mayor of Glastonbury had himself drawn back from that childish laughing fit, and coughing quite uncomfortably now from the acrid smoke he had swallowed, sat himself down on his scout bed. But this bed began so to creak and groan under his weight that he turned to his host and said peevishly, Mr. Zoyland's not been setting a booby trap for me, I hope. You've not won your bet yet, Gurd, returned the Marquis laconically. You understand, I suppose, quite clearly, he went on, taking his daughter by the arm and leading her to a different door from the one they had entered by, that no one has managed to sleep in this room. Some medieval clerk called Blethus, or Bletherus, wrote his histories here, they tell me, but he wouldn't sleep up here. But Mr. Gurd, rising from his creaking bed, dismissed with a wave of his plump hand this nervousness of Monsieur Bletherus. Placidly he bowed good night to them both, and was apparently only anxious to get rid of them. The Marquis, however, with his daughter clinging to his arm, her white face and dark eyes looking wild and scared in the candlelight, was seized with the devil's own malice. I met a crazy Oxford scholar, Gurd, he said, not so long ago, who told me that he'd sooner commit murder than sleep in this old place. He said that Merlin... Stop, father, stop! How can you be so cruel? Cried Lady Rachel, actually clapping her free hand over the man's sneering mouth. Hee hee hee! Chuckled my lord. You won't have won your bet with Will, your worship, till Bellany lets you out in the morning. I'm to lock you in, Gurd, I hope you understand. And of course the turret room will be bolted. They say that a man at the time of Edward IV spent the whole night out there on the Bridge of Sighs, and another fellow only 100 years ago was found, but the girl pulled him hastily and indignantly through the door. Good night, Mr. Gurd, she called out, while the huge mass of oaken boards bound with hand-wrought iron groaned as it closed. Ooh, spooky! Mr. Gurd is spending the night in the haunted room. Well, until we meet again, I hope your haunted nights are as fun as those that we find in Glastonbury. Cheers.